I think I found something as frustrating to the people who have been convicted falsely of sex offenses as to the viewing public or the prosecution who would like to hammer them. Both could be totally frustrated by this piece I'm about to share, and with good reason. So, South Carolina has a bit of a reputation at times of really hammering people, but they also have this strange reputation also of not hammering people. So it's sort of bizarre. They're on both camps, I guess. So I want to share this article that was sent to me just a short time ago. So in this article, you have a young man who is convicted of sex offenses repeatedly over the years and seems to get away with it. So you can see this article. What's the date? Do we have a date on here? Hundreds accused of child sex crimes convicted of lesser offenses. So we've already talked many times about how the prosecution will go with lesser offenses if they can get, if that's the only way that they can get a conviction. So you see here, this is just a couple of days ago, and this is part of the investigative team of whatever channel this is here, WIS 10, I guess, out of Columbia. And they talk about Anderson County. One man spent a chunk of his 20s racking up child sex accusations in recent years. And apparently the convictions were much, much less. He was convicted uh, of sodomizing a 13-year-old boy in 2020 when he was twice the boy's age. And somehow, and they show, part of the arrest warrants, et cetera, here. You can download it. My goodness, I have everything on here, right? But he pled guilty, Austin did, to first degree assault and battery. Not quite the same. Why not a sex offense? Instead of being incarcerated for as much as 20 years, which is what you would get for something like that, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but sentence was suspended for 5 years of probation. Well, that's a hell of a decent thing. And of course, for those who have been caught in these sex things that we've talked about, for which there was no child, for which there was a police decoy, and for which the decoy clearly enticed, induced, persuaded, or coerced, which is what is not allowed, the exact four words not allowed in the federal statutes, but which are routinely ignored by the courts. Here you have a case where somebody actually did something, like Caitlin Grimley, like some others, and for some reason they get off. Still, we had a case of a Ms. Hoppy in the Charlottesville area and Richmond, who has a prominent legal background, family in Richmond, prominent law firm, and she was married to a federal judge, and she got 10 years and tried to go for a psych evaluation, claiming that might reduce or hoping that that might reduce the sentence. But it just goes to show you, as I've said too, that they're all over the map with these cases. All right. And it's very frustrating to the public because the public wants justice. And you might even argue the public wants blood. But how is it that somebody who has one case gets 30 years, as in the case of Stephen Kilpatrick, the physics professor out at Liberty University, who now is serving basically a death sentence because he was sentenced at age 65. And yet you have Caitlin Grimley and this person who have actually had sex with people repeatedly and they get off virtually scot-free. Okay. Here's the amazing thing I'll highlight. He was not immediately ordered to register as a sex offender. It was held in abeyance for psychosexual evaluation. Well, I'd like to get in on that in South Carolina because I've had three, and in my three sex offense evaluations, all of them said that I was not guilty of the crime. Now, that's not quite, that's sort of the abridged version. It's not quite what they said, but that's what it indicated because in each evaluation, they wanted to test whether somebody who had a 30 plus year history of dealing with children suddenly lost their mind and started attempting to go after a child. And of course, what they found in each time was my interest in kids is a virtually non sexual interest. I say virtually because one of the things that they find in these evaluations over and over again is that you have normal sex urges. When you see someone who has developed, things fire in your brain because you have the animal part of your brain too. That doesn't mean you act on it, but consistently they have crucified people for admitting that they have had thoughts. Well, if you're going to be arrested for having a thought and you admit this to an evaluator, well, they're going to take this and just hammer you in these evaluations. And if you go around and arrest everybody with a dirty thought, there's going to be nobody left walking on the streets. And these are how these evaluations are done. Interestingly enough, they're done after the fact in my case and in most cases, and or they're done in jail or prison. And what you find is that it really doesn't point to what they hoped it was. You should have seen the disappointment on probation officer Rachel Taylor's face when she had to confront the fact that what I was saying is actually corroborated by her own stupid tests. But here's a case where they're holding decisions on sex offender registry based on what the evaluation says. Well, there's a lot of people who would like to get in on that one. And it's also odd because very rarely do they do that. They love putting you on the registry because you get so much money. So it's strange that South Carolina would do that because they could use the money. South Carolina is not a wealthy state. Okay. But here again, a year later, arrest warrants show that this guy, Mr. What was his name? Austin, I think it is. Yes, Mr. Austin. It pled guilty to, or is accused, excuse me, of multiple rounds of child sex crimes over 2023, ranging from exposing himself to inappropriate touching to oral intercourse. So maybe he has a mental problem. One charge involved a 9-year-old victim and is still pending. Now, it's nice to see in a way that South Carolina is showing some restraint because he may have a mental problem and maybe he needs to be institutionalized. And of course, they have to protect the children. But that's the odd thing. I talked about the pendulum swinging one way or the other way. And here's a case where it swings way over the other way. They let this guy out. They continue to let him or put him in a position to harm people. And maybe he's mentally deranged, maybe he is not, but maybe we ought to be protecting children. Of course, the pedophile hunters and the people who would want you to be nailed for this, are using this as a great example to arrest everybody and to use the broad brush and make sure everybody gets arrested right away. And this supports their claims. And of course, it doesn't. It does support the claim that the registry doesn't do any good. And maybe since that's out there, we shouldn't be putting this person on it. But at the same point, can't we protect children and have a just system that's fair to everybody, including Mr. Austin? Can't we do that? It seems like it should be easy to do that, but we can't seem to do it. I think it's interesting that they're posting all these arrest warrants and everything on here, but it doesn't really solve the problem. All right. So, it's funny because they looked at 31 months of sentencing data, and what they determined was 1,200 cases involved that same charge. The defendant usually pled guilty to a crime because, as we talked about, we have an extortive plea bargain system, which basically says, okay, you don't want to plead guilty to 10 years, then we're going to rack up enough charges to give you 100 years. And that's how they get people to plead, and then they pat themselves on the back that they got a conviction. Okay. And of course, I love this bit in the article. It says often the crime they pleaded guilty to was different than what they were initially charged with. Well, yeah, that happens a lot of times. I mean, the reporter who wrote this seems shocked that that's a thing. Yeah. As I pointed out in the preceding video just about an hour ago, Al Capone was not convicted of capital murder 1,500 times or whatever. He was convicted of tax evasion. Okay. So they're showing some of the statutes, and they looked at the sentencing data for cases. And, they're going through. It's nice to see they're doing an evaluation of these cases. But they say many defendants were sentenced to little or no time behind bars. And you have to wonder, reporters are people too, and they're justifiably appalled at this. But again, the article doesn't go far enough to explain why this might be. They don't interview any psychologists. They don't talk about the registry as not working. They don't talk about the subtle nuances of the cases. I'm talking about them now, and how simply broad brushstroke one way or the other does not solve the problem of what to do with people who have been committing these crimes, what to do with people who have mental illnesses, how to protect children and still not hammer everybody. I'm afraid this article is going to go forward, and it would be great for the politicians to say, yes, we need to hammer them even more and go the route of Florida, where a Florida federal representative wants to give the death penalty for anybody convicted of a sex offense. Now, this is Luna is her last name. I can't remember what her first name is, but Representative Luna wants to do that. So anybody with a sex offense, well, we ought to kill them right away. Of course, that's a pendulum swinging the opposite direction, right? This can happen through negotiated plea sentences or pleas agreements between prosecutors and defendant. No kidding. Okay. Sometimes they leave it up to the judge to give the sentence, right? So here we have a number of negotiated sentences is not a surprise to a senior legislative policy counsel, that is lawyer, with rape, abuse, and incest network. Okay, RAIN. Of course, RAIN is a network that is very interested in protecting the victims, and one of the ways that they suggest do that is to hammer people with sex offenses, okay? So here you have them saying the criminal justice system does not align with the realities of sexual violence. You know, half of all sexual violence are not even reported to law enforcement. She doesn't say that many sexual offenses are created by, either fictionalized or actually done by law enforcement. Doesn't mention part. And when there are charges, Johnson said they're dismissed and reduced, that this is very common in the US. Actually, it's not as common in the US as she seems to think. In South Carolina, the data found defendants' sex crimes were dropped or dismissed more than a quarter of the time. Here we go, folks. Why aren't we looking at the data, and why aren't we listening to other groups who have a contrasting point of view and will point out some of the information? I'm going to point to I'm going to post here a sex offender, a recent meta-analysis, which indicated two different perspectives. One was from the Office of Juvenile Justice Programs, the SORN office, sex offender recidivism office, and they say, oh, you know, this is terrible. But what they point to in their analysis is very, very misleading, and would lead you to believe that the situation is out of control and you have to hammer people with sex offenses even more. But the independent, nonpartisan, scientific data tells a different story. Okay. Most of, let's see, 1 in 4 cases, the defendant pled guilty to assault and battery. This is South Carolina. So you have to wonder, what's up with South Carolina? There is some indication reported by Midas Touch Network yesterday, I think it was, that among Christian nationalists, the idea of having sex with children is not a terrible thing. Can you believe that? I'm going to try to find that and post it down here as well. But the idea is, you know, these are the people, if you listen, if you go on Christian nationalist groups, they talk about how, you know, forced sex with your wife is not rape. They talk, you know, if she doesn't consent, too bad, that's her job. And they are okay with younger and younger, which is interesting because that's exactly what the wealthy and the well-connected like when we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein Island, and you know, we can go on and on through other scandals throughout history. So since South Carolina is certainly in the deep South, you have to wonder if there's not an undercurrent of this sort of thing here. Okay. The majority of cases that went to trial ended in a conviction. A small percentage of cases went to trial. Attorneys say child sex crimes are among the hardest to prosecute. What are you talking about? Where are they hard to prosecute? Everywhere else in the world, you get hammered for these things. Okay. Due to lack of evidence or problems. Well, that's certainly true. You may not have victims want to come forward. You may have it's so old that the DNA and others are not reliable anymore. But it's also true that juries are very, very uh, much interested in, I shouldn't do that broad brush thing either, that some juries are willing to convict and go in, even though they say they don't have an opinion on the case, they go in with a very definite opinion. I'm thinking of certain cases I've watched where I've listened to the jurors afterwards, and it's kind of interesting what they have to say on the subject. Okay. Um, Johnson said prosecutors can still get child sex crime convictions and lengthy sentences, but it requires a lot of work. Okay. And this is a criminal defense attorney. It's no longer just calling the child witness and putting the burden on the child. We need to be looking as prosecutors for how we can support and not hurt the child through the process by looking at other witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Um, so it's interesting that this particular man in Anderson County named Austin was talking to this 14-year-old girl in 2022. She talked through Snapchat. Okay. And she said they made plans for the man to buy her vape, etc. And that's sometimes the way that people who are adults get access to children for immoral purposes. They offer to buy them something. But rather than, a horrendous rape, it's which the prosecution will often tell you, which sheriffs will often tell you, there's a lot more to the situation than appears to be the case. And it also lends some credence to the Christian nationalist bit, where you can see clearly that Christian nationalists have a very odd way of supposedly protecting children while at the same time molesting them. It's kind of a bizarre thing. Okay. Um, this this situation gets even worse. I'm going to post the article down there. I'm not going to put everything in here, but again, the suspect who did far more than what anybody else did and forced this girl to perform oral sex to get her vape, etc. Well, the suspect was charged with 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of minor, criminal solicitation, unlawfully disseminating obscene material, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And these are second-degree criminal conduct charges, maximum sentence of 20 years. Instead, he pleads guilty to contributing to the delinquency of a minor, which only gives you 3 years. Other charges were dismissed according to court records. Okay. He had to go through counseling. He spent 2 days in jail only. Okay. And of course, he was not on the sex offender registry initially. Okay. WIS investigates, searched the man's name. Nothing appeared on the registry. So once again, folks, just because you have been convicted doesn't and put on the registry, the registry will do nothing to protect children. This case does nothing to protect children. What it does do is inflame people's views of what needs to happen. And they go on to other cases too, which I'm not necessarily going to go through, but it just goes to show you that they need to deal with this more effectively. It's curious as an end note here that when they contacted the Attorney General's office in South Carolina, the office did not respond to multiple interview requests for this story. And you do have to wonder why. Why? Is this an element of a Christian nationalist perspective? Does it have something to do with the Epstein case, where you have people who are wealthy and well connected and powerful who have sex with girls as young as 12 years old? Could this be that there's something more to it? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there is something to that Christian nationalist perspective that permeates the South and may well be an issue playing in this case, as well as why people in South Carolina specifically are getting very soft cases. Norman Michaelation, ICAC Unpacked. Have a good day.